Welcome back to the Chess Geek channel. I have an incredible game to show you today. This was Nemo against Aman Hambleton that happened a couple of weeks ago, and in this game, Aman became Nigel short. And you'll see what I'm talking about in a moment. It's a super cool game. It includes everything you need from a chess game, incredible tactics, a very dramatic finish, time pressure, everything. It's really cool, and I'm excited to show it to you. A final note, I know this will be a little bit of a longer video, but that's only because the game is filled with so many practical lessons, and what I do is I emphasize those lessons when they appear so you can then take them and implement and apply them into your own games so you can really improve from this game. And this game is truly super instructive, and that's why the video is going to be a bit longer. We have a ton to cover. Super instructive game. So right before we start looking at the games, I have one small quick ask. Make sure you guys subscribe to this channel if you enjoy this kind of content. 80% of the people that are watching this video right now are not subscribed. It really helps out the channel and I really appreciate it. Let's get into the games. So before we look at the actual Aman Hambleton game, I want to show you this reference game which happened a long time ago, 1991. It was between Nigel Short, and now I'm sure that a ton of people know this game, which is why I won't spend too long on it. This is one of the most impactful games in chess history, one of the most famous ones. It's truly legendary, and that is why I need to show it to you, just so you also understand the Aman Hambleton game a little bit more deeply. So in this position, Nigel Short maximized all of his pieces. The queen is perfect here, dominating over the dark squares. The rooks are perfect, dominating the d-file. The knight is fine. It can't really truthfully get much better. And so white seems to be fully maximized. And unfortunately, there isn't really any tactics in the position, so it seems like white's position is not necessarily better. But Nigel Short, remember, there's one other piece that no one seems to talk about, the king. And in this position, he did his famous king walk, king h2, king g3, king f4, king g5. Unfortunately, his opponent resigned here. It would have been a little bit sweeter if his opponent would have taken here, which would have allowed king h6 and the unavoidable mate on g7. So far too often people forget that their king is a valuable piece, not only in an endgame, but also in a closed middle game structure. And you have to be careful about how you take out your king, as you will see from the game that we watch momentarily. But if you triple, quadruple check, and you're very cautious, then the king could be the hero of the game. So now that you saw this beautiful, inspiring game, let's see how this applies to the game that just happened a couple of weeks ago. So this was Aman Hambleton playing white against Nemo. They played this at a park somewhere, a very casual game. It wasn't serious, which is why there's going to be a lot of mistakes and blunders, but you can't really fault them. Again, low time on the clock and a very casual kind of friendly game. But it yielded an incredible lesson, practically, and also some nice tactical nuances and ideas. I think this is going to be a really beautiful game that I can share. So the opening went kind of fine for white. Aman established nice pawn dominance on the center. Aman also managed to trade the very strong bishop that often sits on g7. So now these dark squares, although they don't seem too weak just yet, you can imagine, especially if this pawn pushes to e6, there could be some severe weaknesses on the king side on the dark squares. So the position developed, and it's actually black who got a nice initiative in this position. Even though they sacrificed a pawn, all of their pieces got into good squares. The bishop is a monster here, the queen hits f2, and especially when this rook comes down to d2, it becomes abundantly clear that there is some very difficult pressure to deal with. But of course, the grandmaster with the white pieces dealt with it really well, trading or trying to trade the rooks off, which are strong. And this was kind of the first practical lesson. Here, black took the rook, which is at least practically inaccurate. In this position, your pieces are so much stronger than your opponents, the queen, the rooks, and even the bishop. What you need to do is not trade all of the pieces off. If you trade everything off, it's actually this pawn which will be the hero, because aside from the pieces, the pawn structure does favor white here. So instead of trading off even one rook, what you should do is play a move in this position like rook to d5, rook to d4, rook to d5 is also a possibility. The point is just keep the rooks in the game, keep the position relatively stable. You can then work to reroute your bishops, reroute your pieces, regroup them, and then form some attack later in the game. But it's clear that your pieces have more potential here. They don't need to win the game immediately. As long as your pieces have more potential, you want to keep them on the board, so later that potential could become valuable and they'll be able to shine. And so that's the first slight inaccuracy taking here does remove a ton of the pressure that white was facing with this extra, with these worse pieces they have. And now e6, and this is a second practical mistake from Nemo here. First of all, the bishop is a little running low on squares, and indeed g4 was played here trying to punish that. The bishop is not trapped, but you still have to be quite cautious when you play a move like this. But the real reason this is an inaccuracy is that the dark squares, as I hinted upon earlier, are incredibly weak. And you can already start to envision, if you think back to the reference game I showed you in the beginning of this video, what was the key commonality with this position and that position? There were weaknesses on the dark squares. And later, the king got in and the queen got into these dark squares and caused huge mayhem on the board for black. And so, although not every position that has this weakness on the board will lead to that position where the king marches up, it's something to be aware of. The fact that these weakened squares can't practically or possibly be good for black. Okay, so g4 here, the bishop escapes. We have b3 solidifying the pawn structure here. At some point this pawn will run, but for right now it's good that it's defended. In some cases that means the rook is now more free to go on into the game some other way, but the pawn immediately actually starts to run, and a6, and the pawn is very dangerous now. This is also a nice practical lesson. The bishop is super strong here, defended by its own pawn, and I think a lot of people would want to keep the pawn structure like this, because they notice this pawn defends this bishop defends back this pawn, and so there's sort of this very stable and harmonious feeling to the structure over here on the queen side, and a lot of people would be scared to touch that. But if you envision the pawn coming to a6, it's very similar. These two pieces defend each other, and this bishop defends the pawn. And on a6, it's simply stronger because it's so much closer to promotion. And so don't be scared to move around your pawn structure and try to envision a future position which could be more problematic for your opponent. And so continuing on with the game, the bishop centralized, and here sort of you can already see the beginning of the beautiful king walk up the board. And again, the dark squares are the reason that Aman saw this idea. Another potential point is Aman was scared of this sort of idea, and so he wanted to get his king out, and perhaps that's what Nemo thought, which is why she kind of didn't react to this. She just moved her rook and tried to over-defend this pawn here so it could never promote. But then Aman probably shocked Nemo with this move king g3, and then we see the rook being attacked, but ultimately king to h4. And this now takes me to the next practical lesson. And this one is a little bit of a double-edged one, because when you watch historic games, right, games of the past that are modeled games that are just so beautiful and brilliant, you don't want to be scared to apply those ideas and techniques into your own games, but you also don't want to blindly do so. And every game is different, every position, unless the pieces are exactly the same, the position is different, and chances are there's going to be different defensive resources for your opponent. And here, when the king comes to h6, if the queen can then come to f6, f8 and give a check, this king will be forced back, and then h6 check, and this king will be forced back, and this could actually be a disaster with the king, in fact, just becoming weak, starting to go up the board. And so apply techniques and ideas from games you watch for masters. That's why you watch them after all, but only do so with an immense amount of caution. So double check, triple check that there's no extra defensive resources when you try to apply these concepts. Okay, so continuing with the game, we saw king to g7, queen to f4, threatening kind of to come to f6 with tempo, so the king dropped back to g8, and now the king continued up. Now here, bishop to d5 was played, and this is an incredible and super important moment and critical moment of the game, I'd like you to pause the video here and try to figure out what the best and frankly only way forward is. Because white is much better here, but there's one clear good way to continue and one clear bad way, and they're both quite natural and intuitive. So pause the video, let's go through the solution. Of course, the two ways are queen to f6 and king to h6. You want to get checkmate here, that's your goal. That's why you brought your king up here, so try to do so. Now, these two paths seem like they would simply transpose, and the order probably, or at least seemingly, doesn't matter, but it really does. And this is an incredibly important practical lesson, probably the biggest takeaway from this video that I want all of you to take home into your own games. If you are setting up some attack, some pressure, some idea that you have, don't start by setting it up with the most valuable pieces. Set it up very subtly with the least valuable pieces. And here it kind of seems silly because it's a queen and a king. A queen, of course, is very valuable, but here the king is more valuable. And you can consider when the queen comes here, it can only attack the king because it's check, because the king is not equally powerful. It's more powerful than the queen. And so in this position, if you begin by placing the most powerful piece on its square, black will then focus solely on kicking that piece out, and it's quite easy to do so, again, because it's the most valuable piece. So set up with the piece of lesser value, being the queen here, in this position, so queen to f6, because then even if they try to defend this, your queen sits well here. They can't ever kick the queen out, again, because it's of lesser value, and your king hasn't committed yet to a position where it could be potentially dangerous. And so it is important to consider your two options, and often doing something with the piece of lesser value is advantageous. So queen to f6 was the correct way. In the game, king to h6 was played, and now this does get rid of all of the advantage that white has. We'll continue with this momentarily, but I do want to show you how you can win in this position, because I think a lot of people would still doubt me and say, wait, this kind of just will still transpose, especially after the queen heads towards f8. The king comes here, there's going to be a check. What are we doing? Well, how do you convert a position like this? Let's just get rid, clarify the position a bit more. How do you convert a position like this? Your queen is better, there's clear weaknesses, your king is active and has potential, but that's just one threat that you currently have, and that one threat can be handled. You have to create and introduce a secondary threat. This idea of attacking on multiple fronts, right? So you're attacking over here with the weaknesses on the dark squares, you have to do so in other areas as well. And in this position, that means going rook a5. And the idea is a7 is one of your ways to attack. As we mentioned, this is one way to attack, and now also just a center break with rook takes d5 is another way to attack, followed by a move like e6 and playing more in the center. And when you have all of these ideas, it's impossible to defend. And I'll show you this. For example, if queen to f8 was here, trying to stop the king from coming here once and for all, then would follow a move like rook takes d5. And it's really simple now. You can't take here, of course, it's defended. A threat now in this position is a7. If rook takes a7, you're going to lose your queen with this nice tactical idea. And if you don't take that pawn on a7, we could try at some point, of course, to promote it. We can try to continue with e6 in this position. There's a number of ways to continue, but we're just much better. And on the topic of e6, let's go back a move after queen to f8. If instead they tried rook to d8 to try to hold on to this pawn, which I think a lot of people would consider natural, now we can attack with some other methods. We begin by going a7, threatening this promotion at the right moment, and after the queen comes to f8, now we go e6. And it's not so clear why we're doing this, but we're opening up the king, which now introduces even more weaknesses into the position. So after pawn takes, in this position, of course, notice the queen can never take the queen here or really leave this 8th rank, because then this pawn would promote. So we promote here, and in this position, for example, they can't trade because then we'd simply be up a piece. So, for example, they'd take here, but now we can go check, and then we can go check, and then we can go check, and in the end, we win the rook back. And this, you don't even have to see this really to play e6. It's just natural that something like this would occur when your rook is active, you're threatening one weakness here, you're opening up the king, opening up more weaknesses. It's just at some point going to become too many weaknesses to handle. And that is the point the practical lesson that I want to emphasize. If you have one front that you're attacking on, don't only have one front, right? Introduce a second one, because then that will make your first front infinitely more strong, because they can't dedicate all the resources to defend it, because then you're gonna win the game on the other one. And so huge important lesson there. So king to h6, why is this so bad? Well, as I mentioned, now you've committed for the king to be here, so you don't have the time to come and open up these fronts, because this comes with check and then this comes with check, and the king just starts getting absolutely thrown across the board. As it turns out, white is still basically holding on here, but it's very dangerous and it's getting very difficult. In fact, here you'd have to play e6 with a similar idea to last time, trying to open up and create weaknesses in the position. That's what you have to do in chess ultimately. Instead, rook d1 was played. This unfortunately allows a brilliant tactical finish. Rook takes a6. Gorgeous move. If you take the rook here, mate in one. Incredible tactical spotting from Nemo here. So the queen came to f4. Of course, this allows this fork. This wasn't, they had seconds on the clock, huge time pressure, so no one can blame Aman for falling for this. The game ended, just to show you, a couple moves later in this position. He resigned, and the game ended. There was actually, even here already, a way to draw, though. You'd have to go queen to d8, because what's the threat? Well, the rook is attacking the queen, and if the queen really moves, then this pawn will fall with mate. So what you have to do is defend against this and defend against this at the same time. You can't do that, so you go queen check, so you don't do it at the same time, right? You go check, and now after the king moves, you have the time to defend against this other one. And even though they are winning a pawn here, you're going to win it back, and this is a drawn endgame. Thank you for watching this video. I know it was a long one, but this game was filled with so many practical lessons, I had to share it. If you want more videos like this to improve your chess, make sure you subscribe, like this video if you enjoyed and learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.